I'm 40, but I feel like a child, watching everyone around me get older and die. So I'm homesick for the past instead of accepting the terrifying present. How can I stop mourning the past? Well, I grouped the last 3 questions together, including this one, because they all allowed me to talk reasonably about these programs. The self-authoring program has a past authoring component that helps people write out an autobiography. Now, you're suffering from what Freud described as reminiscences of the past. You're possessed by reminiscences. They won't get out of your mind. And what that means to me is, well, it's one of 2 things. One is that there's things in your past that you need to understand more deeply. And that's why they're still calling to you. And there are things in your past that you had, perhaps, that you need to have in the present and the future. And so you could do the past authoring program and write out your past. It asks you to detail the most emotionally significant events that occurred during different epochs or stages of your life. So you have to break your life into a number of stages. I think we recommended 6, but you can break it into as many as you want or as few. And then to detail out the significant positive and negative occurrences, that stand out in your memory from those times. And that'll kind of help put the past to rest, but it also might highlight for you what it is that you're nostalgic for. And then that can help you figure out what to aim for in the future. And so, it sounds like you're rather hopeless about the present and by implication the future. And maybe that's because you don't have a richly enough developed conception of what it could be. So you could go back to your past and find out what it is that you wanted and had, and then you need to make a plan for how you might obtain that in the future. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that because you talked about death, and so you may be longing in some sense for a return to in a state of blissful ignorance where you weren't concerned about mortality. And, the only real medication for that, I think that's real, is to live as worthwhile a life as you can, as full a life, so you don't have regrets. I'm not sure that so much that people are afraid of death. They're maybe afraid of not living enough. And maybe if you lived enough, you could let it go when it was time. I think there's some truth in that. And so if you're overly afraid of death, it may be because you have a lot of unlived life in you. And you could go back to the past and you can find out what you needed and perhaps had then, and then you can strive to attain that in the present and the future. And those exercises could, at least in principle, help you with that. So what are you missing, right? What are you missing that the past had for you? And maybe you write that down. Like, well, I had this and it was really important to me. And I had a loving relationship with someone and I don't have that now. I had the security of a comfortable home life and I don't have that now. It's, well, those are things that now become ambitions, right? Because an ambition and a lack are mirror images of one another. And so if you can identify what you lack, you can derive an ambition from that. And you might say, well, that's impossible. It's like, well, you decompose it into small steps. And that's complicated, but so life is complicated. So there's no way around that. I'm 25. I had a drug problem when I was younger. In my late teens and early 20s, I stole money on multiple occasions. I don't even know who some of those people I stole from are and can't repay them. However, even in the instances where I could apologize or repay, I feel completely unable to. I'm too ashamed. This bothers me all the time. I can't sleep or do anything. I really hate myself. I think that I'm a rotten person and don't know how to handle it. Do you have any advice for this? Well, if I was your therapist, I would say, tell me about every single occasion that you remember where this happened. Now, you can't tell me because I'm not there, but you could write it down. And that would help. And maybe you could write down why you did it. And maybe you could do that with a bit of compassion. Obviously, your behavior was sufficiently reprehensible to be plaguing your conscience, but at least you have a conscience, that's something. And people make mistakes, especially when they're young, especially when they're addled by drug use, let's say. There's plenty of occasion there for misbehavior, that's for sure. And it's pretty common. In any case, you're plagued by this. So the past has still got its tentacles around you. Well, write it down. Write down every episode. Every time you worry about something like that, write it down and get a list. That's your symptoms. Then, the idea of approaching one of these people and apologizing and offering to repay them, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe you could list all the people that you stole from who you could do that with, and then rank order them in order of difficulty, and then think about how you would approach the least difficult of all those people and what you'd say. And maybe you have to write that out. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it, but you could do that to begin with, and then you could decide whether or not you could do it. And if you could do it with the easiest person, and then you could see how that goes. Maybe that actually helps. And then if you can't do that, maybe there's some other means of clearing your conscience. So when you write all this down, write down how much you took. And then maybe your goal could be you donate twice that amount to a charity. So you have to research charity and find one that you think is really valuable, where it would do some good. And so, you don't have to pay it all back at once, but maybe you could pay once a month or whatever. I don't know what your budget is. Maybe twice a month, maybe once every 3 months, whatever you could afford. And so then you've atoned for your sin, let's say, and you've transformed something bad that the people who experienced have probably already forgotten about. I mean, unless you were stealing huge amounts of money and destroyed their lives, they've probably moved on. And so you could transform your nefarious actions into something that was good. Now, maybe donation to charity, wouldn't do it for you. You could try it once and see if that helps, pay off one of your existential debts and see if that helps. It's a negotiation with yourself. And so then I guess I would also ask, are you more broadly depressed and anxious? You know what I mean? So are you fixating on this in a manner that's truly counterproductive, that's reflective of a deeper issue with depression or anxiety? And you'd know that, for example, if, while you said you can't sleep or do anything, you really hate yourself, that's signs of generalization beyond the confines of these misdeeds. And so if that's the case, then perhaps even if you did atone for what you had done, other preoccupations with previous instances of unacceptable behavior would start to plague you to the same degree. That's a more complex problem, and if that's the case, then, your best bet then is to find a competent mental health professional and have your circumstance evaluated. And, if you're really torturing yourself to death about this, despite the fact that you've apparently ceased your drug abuse, well, maybe there's something else fueling it, and you may need to investigate that. So that's about all I can think of along those lines.
Let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it, you value it, and no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this, I can't stop communicating with my mother who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule. So